The miner's path stretched back into the past for us and up Ben Bulben that January morning. The day was black and white and every shade of grey, like a photo from the 30s, with grim-jawed, black-shawled, long-skirt women and children in bare feet. We came on our grandparents' home, Thurmore, Glencar, still roofed but hearthless, grooved in the valley and blind to the lakes, the slope, the bay. We remembered the story of their wedding day. Church was ringed with soldiers. On the run, the best man couldn't join them at the altar, so a modest labourer stood in long socks to the knee. The married couple jaunted home to the table spread with sweet cake and stout, a buried hawthorn and the wild briar backed by fern. The bride was shown how to hold a black revolver in her white wedding glove, how to steady her eye, her hand, and brace against her husband. She practiced on a plank of wood all day. To the left, the telegraph poles gasped upward. We bowed like the rusted pylons on the right, keeping on for cleft in rock and stopping often. We traced the miner's path to the barred Barytus shaft, emerging in the hard white mist, the outline of the hostel, room enough for 18 men. From the litany of shadows, our fathers and our uncles stepped out of the mud of the mine, loose-limbed, beardless men in 50s caps, their youth and hunger bitter from the damp. Each was eager for a rationed puff, a spume of smoke as someone coughed and spat, its red eye pinched by thumb and finger and stashed in a waistcoat pocket. scenes of sleet and hailstones. Darkness closed on wheels and cogs, on trespassers, on innocence and poverty. My cousin played the foggy Jew on her silver whistle. All I could do was take a pinch of snow in a black velvet glove and feel bone-cold misery. A raven free in a rain cloud passed over us, said nothing.
Hello, my name is Michelle Brennan, and on behalf of Sligo Library, I want to welcome you to our January edition of The Word in association with ATU Sligo, with the BA in Writing and Literature at ATU Sligo. Tonight, we are delighted to have Thomas Morris as our guest, our first guest for 2024. Thomas is a former editor of The Singing Fly and a Granta New Young Writer for 2023, and he'll be talking to us about his writing, including his new collection, Open Up. Thomas will be in conversation with our friend Elske Rahill, novelist, writer and lecturer with ATU Sligo. For music, we will have Mary Branley reading some of her collection along with some absolutely amazing music, as we've just heard so far. And we invite the audience to take part in our audience Q&A and our open mic. So I'm going to just officially hand you over now to Elske, who is going to take over from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Tom, thank you so much for being here. For those who don't know Tom's work, his first short story collection, We Don't Know What We're Doing, came out in 2015 to great acclaim and won several awards. I'm going to try to review them here. The Wales Book of the Year Award, the Rhys Davies, is that how you pronounce? Rhys Davies Trust Fiction Award, and the Somerset Maugham Prize. So this new collection, Open Up, which is is 5 very long short stories and very different, but all treating the same theme. Is that fair to say? Coming at the same thing, the same very specific thing, in very, very different ways. And I think that is sort of a new way of doing a short story collection. So the title isn't from any of the stories; it's its own title. Did you feel that writing this, that this was a sort of slightly different form or genre, or that you were doing something different with what a short story collection means?
First of all, thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you to the library, thank you to the university, thank you to the friend Elske Rahill for doing this. There's 8 years between my 2 books. It was a long time of trying to write this, a long time when I thought it might never happen. And one of the things that keeping me going was the idea of there being readers or being people that maybe I would read to or talk about the work. So I just want to thank you for fulfilling your end of the deal without realizing it. As I said to it, I think of this as a suite of stories rather than a story collection. What do I mean by that? I don't know. I put it to my editor that this was a suite rather than a collection. And she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I don't know. And she gave me a book on Bach's cello suites so I could read it. And when I was in a situation like this, I'd be able to explain what I meant. I've yet to read that book, but my sense is that these stories are speaking to each other in some way, that there's a kind of a sound that's in common. And if it is a sound in common, it's perhaps the inner lives of boys and men, I'd say.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that as well, because in some ways, I'm going to mispronounce the second story.
Yeah.
Can you say it for me?
Abercariad.
That story.
I'm from Wales, in case, yeah.
Maybe even more so than the others. Ostensibly, they're dealing with masculinity, I think. right, as a kind of on a first reading. But then there's this very pervasive sense of all of the characters seeking the same, seeking authenticity more than anything, and what that is, and getting sort of confused about like this sense of having lost a self or trying to rediscover a self
Yeah.
that has something to do with masculinity.
Yeah, I should say, like, I feel there's a drop of real blood in each of these stories. And maybe what speaks to your question is to explain a little bit of how I came to
Yeah,
write
that would
the
be.
book, which was, so I moved to Dublin when I was 19. I'm 38 now, it was half my life ago. I published my first book when I was turning 30, and I was still living in Dublin, and I was editing this thing in Fly, probably reading 1,000 short stories a year in submissions, and finding it hard to kind of get to my own work. I won a couple of prizes, saved some money, and thought, right, I'm going to go back to Wales and write my second book. At this point, my mother had moved on to a farm, which had belonged to my grandparents. So I thought, great, it'll be really quiet, peaceful, I'll get some work done. And previously, I'd visited in the summer holidays and gotten some good work done. What I hadn't anticipated was what it'd be like to be in a farm, in a village, outside of a village in South Wales, in the winter, when I can't drive, and I'm living with my mum. I kind of went mad, to put it lightly. And one of the things that when my first book came out, I gave it to her to read, and she said, I'm very proud of you for having published a book, but I think that you know more.
I think.
I think that you know more. And I was like, oh, you could have just said you're proud. That's fine. And I was annoyed, but I kind of knew what she meant in a way. And I felt with the first book, I'd reached a ceiling. I'd kind of reached a threshold. I'd gone as far as I could go. I'd never worked as hard on anything in my life. But I didn't know if the limit was me or the short story form
Yeah.
or what was going on. But I had, I think, on some kind of intuition, which was then coming out in the reading. I found myself drawn to work that was dealing with the interior, with the inner life. I was reading Franz Kafka, Virginia Woolf, Clarissa Lispector, and through reading that, I started to encounter my own inner life. And I'm not exaggerating, and I've a couple of friends here today on the website just recently. I was like, I didn't know I had an inner life until I turned 30. And for example, I remember reading this book, like 32, called Talking to Women, which is, it's not a self-help guide, I promise you. It's a book of interviews that the writer Nell Dunn conducted in 1964. She'd published a book, she was like 28, maybe she just got married and had a baby, and she was thinking, what's life going to be like for me as a female artist in 1964 and a mother? Would I be able to do these things? So once a month, she sat down with a friend over a bottle of wine and they chatted. 9 different friends, 9 different interviews. I urge everyone to go read this book. And the range of friends, like one of the people is a woman who worked in the butterbean factory. And the next woman is Edna O'Brien, who's 32 and just published 4 books and has 2 kids. And I was astounded by the way in which these women were so fluent in their emotional life, and the way that through their friendship they were helping each other navigate their inner world. And I compared that to, say, my friend Berwin, God love him. When I was like 21, I went through a breakup. He came, picked me up from my house, took me to his house. We played FIFA on the PlayStation for 4 hours, and he brought me home. He's like, "You all right?" I was like, "Yeah, good, thank you." and that was the emotional support. And it was through kind of reading and through starting to have conversations with my own friend, having read this book, that I started to come into my own inner life, my own inner world. And some of those feelings that were coming up was this sense of feeling inauthentic or not really knowing who I was. And there's something I've encountered in friends and family around the age of, perhaps from 30s or 40s. It can happen at any time. There's a sense that, like, I might not, like, there's a kind of a self that you formed in adolescence to kind of get by, and maybe some coping mechanisms, and that goes so far, and then you get stuck, or you end up doing the same loops and patterns of behaviors, and it's like, well, who am I? Like, for example, I'm like an inveterate people pleaser, and I'm like, I'll be places, I'm like, why am I here? I don't want to be here. And that sense of being inauthentic to oneself. And I think I was working through this stuff out through the stories.
I wonder, is language something to do with that. So that book, Talking to Women,
Yeah.
can they not hear him?
How do I sound now?
So,
Wow. Look for strength in our voice.
it's very much about women articulating through words with one another. And I think in this book, the interior isn't articulated in words, it's place and space in a way. There are these internal spaces that the characters enter. I hope I can form this question correctly. But I suppose I'm asking about that, first of all, about how is that something to do with masculinity, which I kind of feel it is in your book. And then what that means for writing and writing fiction and how we articulate things slightly differently in fiction to the way we might articulate in a conversation or in an essay. Or do you know what I mean? Is there that, does fiction or the short story make that space somewhere?
I can only speak for myself. The writing is where I go to feel. And for so long, I felt so far removed from my emotional life. As explained, I didn't know I had an inner life. And it would be like through kind of digging and through drafting, it's like I was chasing a feeling. So, for example, there's a story in this book called Passenger, and it took me 4 years to write. I went through 82 drafts. And it started with the conceit, or this idea that, like, whenever I'm on a bus going to an airport, I start getting anxious. I start catastrophizing. I start imagining we're going to be late, which I think is a normal enough fear. You go into a flight. Doesn't matter if you've left 7 hours in advance, and it's a 20-minute bus ride, I can be late. And it's like, I'm going to get there, and they're going to find something wrong with my passport. They're going to find cocaine in my bag. I don't take cocaine. I've never carried cocaine, but suddenly another cocaine, and they're going to throw me into a dungeon, and I'm like all this catastrophizing. And I thought maybe I can write a story which takes the duration of a bus ride, which kind of tracks some of these feelings. And I wrote this draft in a couple of weeks, and I was like, that's not quite it. I'm not quite getting there. And I realize now in retrospect, what I was trying to do was trying to get under the feeling and trying to kind of get to some root of it. Not that that's necessarily what has happened in the story, but like it began with just two friends on a holiday, and I thought, no, what if it's a relationship? And like, well, where's this anxiety coming from? And then the story is an attempt to kind of track this anxiety, and the anxiety that arises for this particular male character on his first holiday with his girlfriend after 9 months. There's all these insecurities, all this sense of, as he's getting closer to her, this fear of being seen, and this fear of not measuring up. And also what's coming up is stuff from childhood around, say, financial precarity, having grown up poor, and she didn't grow up poor. She grew up with her own bundle of issues, as we all have. But suddenly he's starting to feel inadequate.
And he feels it physically. Like it's kind of that the poverty is in his body, isn't it?
It's kind of it's really embodied. He feels like he's marked by it in some kind of way, but he's hiding it. And so for a long time in the drafting, I had him imagining this catastrophizing. And I was keeping these two things separate. He's on holiday, then he's back. And at some point in the drafting, I thought, the boundary between the real and the fantasy, maybe there is no boundary. Because when I am on a bus and I'm catastrophizing, imagining the worst things, and my body's going into fight or flight, it may as well be happening. It's like the body can't distinguish between the real and the unreal. And so in the story, that boundary gets collapsed. And so he's always at the airport being thrown into a cell, whilst he's also in the hotel room with his partner. And I just wanted in some way to kind of capture what it's like to be in a body, but also to be running the software of the mind constantly.
And they are having this kind of conversation about feelings that's just not real while all this other stuff is going on beneath. The only story in this collection where there is a father present, it's a seahorse father, so that's slightly different. But there is a kind of the absent father figure looming through the whole thing. Maybe that would just be a good introduction to your opening story. And I think your opening story kind of sets that out. So we've got the football match, and the absent father coming to sort of take him out for the day.
Yeah.
Would you be
Yeah.
all right to read a little bit from that? And then maybe we could also read one from the...
Yeah.
But I'm going to call it the second story, I think. 'Cause
I'm going to read the first 5 minutes of the opening story called Wales. So when I get to the end, it's not the end. And the lovely thing about reading a first story, and from the start, you don't have to explain anything. But yeah, I'm still talking. Okay. Oh, I do want to say something, which is what I discovered when I Wikipedia'd tweets was often there's like a prelude, a shorter piece, which sets a tone for the rest of the book. So you mentioned a lot of these stories are long. This is the shortest by
by a long shot,
yeah.
yeah.
Wales. It's been 3 months since they saw each other, and Gareth wonders if his father will recognize him. He pictures his mother upstairs, sitting at a dressing table, practicing her face. He wonders if his father will come into the house. He thinks, if Dad comes in, Wales will lose. Hearing his mother on the stairs, he moves from the window and settles on the couch, the gap in the curtains, the only evidence he was standing there, waiting for his father's car. Got your phone? She asks. Yep. Text when you're on your way back, all right? Yeah, he says. A car horn beeps outside. His father has arrived, and he isn't coming in. There's a pause, then his mother smiles. Well, have a good time, she says, and make sure you get something to eat. I've told your father, but you know what he's like. Gareth nods, absorbs it all. If Wales win tonight, everything will turn out okay. His mother will find a wad of cash stuffed in the walls, and they won't need to move out. But if Wales lose, the repo man with his bulging muscles will return and take Gareth's bike. Or the ceiling will cave in and fall down on him while he's watching cartoons on the couch. Wouldn't it be mad if you see me in the crowd on the telly, he says. His mother grins. I'll keep an eye out for you, she says. Outside, the March evening air is fresh on his cheeks. Young man, his father says in greeting. All right, Gareth replies. They drive up Caerphilly Mountain, Gareth secretly studying his father's head. One day, he'll be able to read people's minds. He just needs to learn to focus harder. What are you looking at? His father asks. I think you're going bald, Gareth says. Wonderful, his father replies. Another thing for me to worry about. They drive on. When they hit traffic, his father instructs Gareth to open the glove compartment, where he finds the 2 tickets, sacred and shiny, his first real match at a real stadium. So what do we know about Northern Ireland, his father asks. Any predictions? They've got some good defenders, Gareth says. But Wales will win. I'm going to say 2-0. Ramsey header and a Gareth Bale bikie from a halfway. His father laughs, then in a quiet voice explains that because it's only friendly, Ramsey and Bale have been rested and won't be playing. All right, Gareth says. It'll still be a good game. Just don't get your hopes up, all right? And put his tickets back now, before you lose them. His father refuses to pay for parking, so for 20 minutes they drive round one residential avenue after another, finally finding a spot in a street lined with trees. Let us hope we can remember where we're parked, his father says, as they walk past houses 3 stories tall, with tiled porch and coloured glass on the doors. They're lovely houses, Gareth says. They'd probably cost you £1 million, his father says. £1 million, Gareth says. That's insane, that is. They walk on, Gareth taking 2 steps at every one of his dads. Slow down, will you? I'm literally only 10. Well, hold my hand then. Nah, you're all right, Gareth says. On the high street, the air throbs with horns and whistles. Crowds with flags draped over their shoulders spill into the road, the cars slowing and honking. Outside a pub, a group of men in red t-shirts toot trumpets and trombones, and one man plays the sax and another bangs a drum. Arms aloft, a fan sing, I love you, baby. And a woman, dressed like a daffodil, jumps up and down, her pint spilling onto the pavement. Let's get some grub, his father says. They eat outside the chippy, leaning against the window. The chips are hot and moist with vinegar. Inside, a girl with a red dragon stenciled on her cheek stands beside her dad with a burger and a can of Coke. If she looks at Gareth, Wales will win. Enjoying the chips, his father asks. Yeah, Gareth says, they're lovely. As they're about to leave, the girl smiles through the glass. And then I'll give you a very short reading from Abacariad, the aforementioned seahorse story, which is a 15,000-word story about seahorses. What you need to know, because I'm just jumping in the middle here, is this is a story narrated by an unnamed seahorse. He does have a name, but we never learn it. His brothers all have names, and father has a name. And he's, at this point, telling a story that his father had told him about how they came into the world. And famously, well, not necessarily so famous, but are seahorses monogamous? This is a really big question in the seahorse research community. And if you Google, someone's nodding saying yes, but you get different answers. You get different answers. But this particular guy had planned on being monogamous with his partner. Is there anything you want to say?
Just think maybe a bit more context. That
Bit
the
more
dad
context. The father.
that the father's what the father's told him, maybe, or does that come up here?
All his life. Well, it comes up. We'll get to that.
Yeah,
we'll
okay,
get to that.
Okay.
And in case you don't know, in seahorses, it's the males who get pregnant. It must have been because of the seasons, our father concluded. The skies above were darkening, and the waters were becoming rough. It would have been too dangerous for her to visit. He considered going to find her, but his brood pouch was stretching, bulging, as we all began to hatch and swim around inside him, jostling to be the first ones out into the world. He was close to bursting. He needed to conserve energy, so he decided to stay put. 5 tides later, alone and afraid, he went into contractions and thought he saw Mother peering at him from behind a rock, but it was only a hallucination, the delirium of birthing pain. Because then, a moment later, it began. He thrusted and he expelled 60, 70 tiny horses into the sea. He tried to gather the fry together, but they kept swimming off in all directions. His blood ran cold and his skin turned grey, but there was no time to think. Another surge came, and another gust of foals sprung forth out of his reach, and so it went. Each time he managed to gather a couple of small fries by his side and recompose himself. Another batch would be expelled from his pouch. Another school of tiny horses flung out into the world, confused and alone, swept away by the unforgiving tide. Come here, he shouted to them. I'm your father, and I love you. Yeah, the context would have made a bit more sense there, which is...
I think,
yeah.
yeah. Sorry, I didn't know which bit you were going to read. But I suppose what's really interesting about this story is if you said you were writing a story about seahorses, it sounds gimmicky or something. It sounds,
Yeah, I'd learned to
or
stop
it sounds like a little trick, or you know.
Yeah.
But actually, some of the most emotionally engaging writing is in that piece, and not just the father's experience, the son's experience, but even when they go there to that kind of mating ground, that terrible, you know, you're kind of brought back to being a teenager on a dance floor, you know, that kind of like, it's sort of beautiful and amazing, but also, was this a theme you wanted to look at, or did you start with, seahorses are interesting, let's see where this goes? Like, how did that?
I discovered if I think I know what the story's about to begin with, I'm fucked.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't go anywhere. Or it becomes very flat. And for a long time, I was trying to write about themes. Like, I'm going to write about something very serious and literary. And this is how I imagine it. I'm in front of my computer and I'm writing something serious and literary. And it's just dead. And then just here on my left, the seahorse is like go on, write a story about me, write a story about me. And there's something about looking askew, which I caught myself off guard,
Yeah.
and not knowing what it was about, the themes became apparent to me. And there was something about the playfulness, the way I had to like invent things, which kind of got me out of the drudgery, which for a long time I was here just trying to write very serious literary stuff, kind of lacerating myself. And at the time, autofiction, so kind of, autobiographical fiction was in vogue, and I was trying to do that, but it didn't work. And I realized I kind of have to come in at my concerns askew. And it literally began just with a very silly idea or an opening line, which isn't in the story anymore, but it's like, I never met my mother. She left before I was born. And I thought, well, that's a way in. And it was 2 years of working on the story. Because also it's one thing to think, I'm going to write a story about seahorses, but then what's the story? I'm just like, seahorse looks like this. And during my research on Google, one of the things I discovered is that male seahorses and female seahorses are they keep different territories, and they meet in a mutual third to mate. And I took some poetic license and enlarged the scale, and I had it that this other place was quite far away. And in the story of his father, he's raising these 7 young boys, and he's trying to teach them to be men and give them impart values and telling them about the importance of monogamy and family and all these life lessons. Meanwhile, his brother, Uncle Noel, keeps coming in, always pregnant, going, "Oh, it's great, it's great." And he never raises these young fry, and it's Abercariad is the name of this place where they go. And it's a Welsh word I've made up. So Aber means kind of confluence of waters or meeting of the waters, like Aberystwyth, you might have heard. And then Cariad with a C is a Welsh word for love, but I put a K on it. And he's like, yeah, Abercariad is great. You go, you meet these fillies, you have sex, you get pregnant, it's class. I'm such a good bloke. So the boys want to go immediately, but the dad's like, you're not old enough yet. And they're like, come on, we're 3 months old, we're ready to go. Let us out. So then this causes attention. And there's something, it becomes kind of enchanting to them, this idea of this other place where we're going to go to become adults in some kind of way. And that allowed me to write about experience of my own, kind of like coming of age and own feelings that if I was writing it head on, I don't know how honest I would be. But it also, there's something again about going beyond. What I'm really seeking to do when I'm writing for myself is I'm after a feeling. And there's something about going beyond realism or something unreal which allows me sometimes to get at a feeling more fully.
Yeah.
And it's hard to explain.
Or it allows the feeling to,
Yeah.
you're not constraining it.
Yeah.
And
the story enacts for feeling as well. It's not just it's not just saying I feel this. It's that the movements of the story in some way explain, they're kind of going around the water constantly, which is how when I was at home on the farm, kept going around problems, kind of ruminating in some way.
And they do, I do feel like there's something here, and they're all the stories are coming at the same thing in very, very different ways. But that isn't, you didn't set out to write on themes of masculinity and authenticity and identity.
No,
it's just something that...
Yeah, I should say I wrote a lot more than what's in this book during this period of time. I wrote a couple of novellas that I haven't published. I was writing a couple of screenplays. I was writing other stories. And for a long time, I couldn't see how I could bring things together. And I'd have this Word document, and I'd put stuff in, and I'd had 12 stories, and I was like, that's not a book. And it only became a book when I started taking things away. And it's like, these five speaking to each other, yeah. And if I organize them in this way, then they're suddenly in conversation with one another. Which I think is something I would really urge if people are putting a story collection together, is sometimes...
Not to write it, I've made that mistake. I'll just write another one to put another perspective there.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that. It actually works by curating what you've done. Yeah. I'm going to ask a completely different type of question now, because we have a lot of students here who are young writers, and And people always say when you ask for their kind of biog, they say, well, I published my first book in this year when I was editing this. And I think when you know this, when you're young and you're starting out and all you have is the stuff you're writing, and it feels like you're a long way away from that point. Like, and what I suppose what I'm asking is for you to fill in that space now for the students between being a student in Trinity. When I met you, you were interning. Were you interning?
Yeah, at Lilliput.
At Lilliput. So, between that point
Yeah.
where you're like, I want to be a writer, I'll go and study English, or I'll go and study writing and literature, and I'll write. And I published my first book, and I'm an editor in SligoLibrary. Like,
Yeah.
if you can just kind of fill that in for everyone, because I think it is a really kind of treacherous and complicated pathway.
Yeah. So this is I'll talk a bit about my experience, knowing people come at these things in such different ways. So I moved to Dublin when I was 19. I was working in a horrible office in Cardiff at the time, trying to raise money to come to Dublin. And before, like 2 days before I moved to Dublin, I bought myself a laptop. £400, I remember thinking, that's so much money. And I come to Dublin, it was the first time I had a computer that was my own. It wasn't a family computer, so I could write things on it that no one else would read. And suddenly I don't know why, like I never did this with a notebook or anything, but suddenly I started just writing little bits of things. So it had been 19, and little bits of memories.
Did you buy the laptop with that in mind, or did it just seem like an adult thing to do because you're going to study?
It seemed like an adult thing to do. I thought, and I'll type up my essays and I can do this. And then I just found myself creating a folder called Writing. And previously I'd been like writing songs, although I have no musical ability, I should stress, but like writing lyrics of things. And then suddenly I was trying to understand my having left Wales as well. I was trying to understand that distance, trying to understand parts of myself. And I was writing things out, and I remembered after a couple of weeks, that if I put this memory with that memory, not only would I now have 3 pages rather than a page on that, like I can maybe make a story here if I make up a bit in the middle. And I maybe wrote one story my first year and maybe another story my second year. But that folder, even when I got another laptop, I kept the folder, kept everything on there. 10 years later, when I was 29, I had 1,141 files in there. And some of them may have been like 14 drafts of a story. Some of them might just be like one line, an idea for a story. A man wakes up to find himself transformed into a Beatle. Not just any Beatle, but John Lennon. During the sleep-in with Yoko. Like, a silly idea which I never went anywhere. But also within that were like a number of stories, an unpublished novel, which I remember your partner Sean read and told me in very directly it wasn't very good. And I spent 3 years writing this novel whilst I was working, sometimes interning, taking jobs where I could for.
During that time, just to kind of remind you of the kind of the texture of that time, I remember being really jealous because you had a job writing for a gentleman's club newsletter.
Yes.
And you were getting paid like €250 or something that seemed at the time phenomenal. Like these little jobs that you end up doing to kind of.
I was trying to like stay in Dublin. A bit of me felt that if I left Dublin, I wouldn't be able, like something terrible would happen if I went home in some way. So I needed to keep in Dublin, and I didn't come from money. I didn't have any money. I was in debt from college, and I was just taking any jobs I could. And sadly at the time, always unpaid internships to work in publishing. Like I had just so many people doing me favors, like friends, and you can live here and not pay much. I was on the dole, but didn't tell the boss. All this different stuff. Just going to keep it going, and just these little freelance gigs and what have you. The main emphasis for me, and which I was able to do because I had no responsibilities beyond like myself, was like writing. So I built my life around it. And like writing was the thing that came first. And I was often writing at night. I'd write between like 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. So I took jobs that worked in the afternoon and evening so that I could have that time to write. But this, I think it's important to talk about this novel, which didn't get published and will never be published, while I'm alive anyway, it began, I remember it was like Valentine's, I was with a friend having a pint, and this line came to me, which was, "My mother married a wrong man." I didn't finish my pint. I was like, "I've got to go home." There's a line, and I just pulled a story out of this line over 2 or 3 years, and by the end I had a 50,000-word novel where nothing happened, and nothing happened very slowly. And at the time, I was imitating this idea of what I thought a serious literary novelist was in 2012. Quiet, moments, pregnant.
Soulful.
Yeah. People saying, well, things were different in the past, weren't they? You know, things like that. And I was afraid of encounter. I was afraid of making something happen. I was sharing work with friends, and that's been so important. I'm still sharing work with some of those same friends. But I decided to go do a master's. So I went to East Anglia in Norwich. And my feeling was at that time, I was 27, I'd been writing for 8 years, but I'd gotten as far as I could on my own. And I had reached some kind of dam, some kind of, like I mentioned earlier, some kind of ceiling. I was like, I know. And I think a feeling that many of us might have is that, like, my tastes are here and my ability is there. But
you know you're good. You know you have.
Yeah, sometimes I know I'm good, but like sometimes I don't. But like I know there's more what I'm doing, and I felt all these jobs I was taking on was just like I just need to really sit down and really work on this. So for a year, my job or the thing I was meant to do was write stories, and once a month we had to turn a story in for workshop, and by the end of the year I had most of the stories for my first collection. And I remember thinking, well, this is great. I'll write a story a month for the rest of my life. I'll have loads of stories. And then I came out of the masters, and some people who may have had that experience of or were thinking about that. It's like you suddenly the structure goes. You don't have those deadlines, and so what has become increasingly important to me is those friends who I share work with, like keeping each other accountable.
Yeah.
Having like magazine deadlines to submit for. But I think there is also something to be said for the time when we discussed this time we're not writing.
Yeah.
It's kind of important as
that's
well. No, but like at some point, like after the masters or after the
Yeah.
course of ever, or for people who like sometimes life just doesn't allow you to write. People die, you get ill, you get depressed, your mental health goes haywire, and like, but to beat yourself up about not having written,
That's an extra problem.
you're
Yeah.
just adding a thought beyond thought. So to be
And
able
also waste. I think to expect waste, what feels like waste in your work. Like you're saying, this 50,000-word novel, you don't want it to be published, whatever, but you wouldn't have got to a point where you're writing these stories had you not written your way through that novel.
yeah.
Hit that. Do you know what I mean? Like kept pushing forward through it.
I'm struck by the amount of musicians talk about, we had 50 tracks and then we put 12 on the album.
Yeah.
It feels part of
It's
it.
hard to do.
Yeah.
But yeah. I think that takes us to
Yeah.
Mary. Thank you so much, Tom. It's brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Thomas. So lovely.
Oh, I'm wrong. Sorry, I'm wrong. It's audience Q&A. I'm so sorry. Thanks, Tom. Do you have any questions? Emma?
Thanks. You've talked so wonderfully about your work, and it's just been such a pleasure to listen to you both. I have a question about the kind of the auto-fiction route of your first practice, like your desire to kind of start at that point, and not so much about your own self, but writing about family. Okay, that idea, that point at which you said, okay, I had this memory and I had this memory, and I said maybe I'll just make a bit up in the middle and I'll have a story. And I work with some of the students here on oral history, and then giving them agency over their past, but you have other people in the mix, right?
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you'd speak to that journey of desiring or feeling comfortable, right, to write your story how you experienced it. And perhaps tensions around that with the other people that exist in those books.
After my first book, my mother banned me from writing about her. And so I come from like a single parent family. Like my parents separated when I was young. So my way around it was writing a seahorse story where the male gets pregnant. So that reversed the dynamic where the female parent has left. So that, in a way, was my way of kind of going clandestine into it, so that I wasn't repeating the same thing. But I know as well, I've been an editor with the Sting and Fly for, I've just left, but I was there for like 12 years. And I've been mentoring writers, working with a lot of new writers, a lot of like older writers, and it comes up an awful lot, this thing of, can I write that? And then I remember talking to a friend who's published like 4 or 5 books, and she said, I can't write that while my mother's alive. I said, can't write or can't publish? And she said, can't write. And that sense of, would almost feel like a betrayal or something. And there's the moment I read from that first story, where the boy, Gareth, he's at the window waiting for his father, and he hears his mother coming down and he moves. And that thing of wanting, A, to not be seen to be vulnerable for father, but also trying to protect his mother's feelings in a way of not wanting her to see that he's hurt in some way. And I think that there's a number of people, we feel a responsibility, and that's like a healthy responsibility. And it's a negotiation that each person has to kind of come to terms with. The one thing I think sometimes is like, unlike my friend, I was like, well, I'll write it, if only for myself. I'll write something to get at the thing, because I need to. It's like a physical need for me. We were saying, like, if I don't write for a long enough period, I get very physically tight. I just get very like edgy. And if there's something I had to get off my chest in some way, or there's a Robert Frost quote about every poem beginning with a lump in the throat. That idea of, well, I'll get it down, and then I'll work out later what needs to be changed to get away with it. But yeah, I sympathise with everyone who's doing that. Yeah.
You have to do it, don't you? To get through it.
Yeah.
Any other?
Thanks very much. And the first story, Wales, I read is so subtle. So I think all of that rewriting and really, so it has to be so subtle to describe the position of such a young child and their emotional. I just wanted to ask a little about gender in Abercariad. I found it's quite a queer story in that you're queering maternity and paternity, but queering it again because of the seahorse biology. Like, it's such an interesting way. And I kind of felt when I was reading it, did you actually, like, Uncle Noel is hilarious. He has this classic sort of way of going, oh, those fillies, they'll just use you and abuse you. And it's like so many of us women might have described a nightclub scene. Did you actually have to occupy the other gender position to write, or, how did gender play out for you as a writer in that, I guess, is what I'm interested in.
I think I was discovering it as I was going, and once I realized that, I decided that, like, Uncle Noel would still be macho. He's like, I'm so pregnant. I'm such a stud. Look at me, I'm so pregnant. That, like, the idea that, in a way, what the behaviors are kind of arbitrary, but it's just according to the social construction. Well, that's a male thing to do, whereas for another animal that would be seen as like effeminate or something. So it's kind of like the abiding, like the abiding arbitrariness of so much of this, but also the way that then that, like, people, for some people, or and there's so much anthropomorphizing going on there, but like it's still like a badge of honor, and it's almost like it's so abiding for us, but I almost couldn't let that go then when I come to here, but like, that it's a little comment on it, but I think had I gone in with the idea of like I'm now going to discuss like gender performativity and stuff like that, the thing would have fallen apart. So I'm hoping it's done with a light touch. Yeah.
Tim?
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. I've a question about where you're from. So you're a Welshman, obviously, but it appears that your formative writing years and the greater part of your professional writing life has been in Ireland. But then you went back to Wales to write this book. So you're a writer from Wales. Are you a Welsh writer?
Yeah, I have no issue. I would proudly say I'm a Welsh writer. In Wales, there's an odd thing where there's a phrase like Welsh writing in English in order to distinguish it from like
I didn't.
Cymraeg, as in like Welsh language writing. Whereas, it's not so
don't
much
get
that.
that here.
Yeah, so I just say I'm a Welsh writer. But it got like where, as a question, it came up for me. I received an email in like August 2022 saying you're on the list of 20 best British novelists under 40. Sign here if you want to continue with this. And I was like, well, first of all, I think the age limits are kind of strange. Why is that? What happens if you're 41? Suddenly now you're not young. It's nice to be called young. And I was like, do I identify as a novelist? I do have a bad novel in the drawer. British? And I kind of went in my head about it. It felt like maybe I'll reject this, like I'd reject an OBE or something. And I was like, well, wait a minute now. And the idea that, like, I remember reading an anthology of British writing from the 80s when I was in college and seeing no Welsh writer in there. I saw Samuel Beckett in there, in a Brit, like, exactly. And I was like, well, I want to kind of represent in a way. I wanted independent Wales. I'm a member of the Independent Party, and hopefully one day a Welsh writer wouldn't get to be in that British one. But whilst we're subject to that, I kind of want that story to be told. And particularly with this book, where like a third of Welsh children are growing up in poverty at present, and I'm like the last couple of years been coming to terms with like the long-lasting effect of growing up in poverty. I was like, I really want that story Wales, and it's called Wales, and it's in that Granta anthology, and that felt really important to me. I'm a Welsh language speaker. I thought that was important. And then they announced the list, and there's another Welsh language speaking writer on the list. I was like, didn't even need to be there at all. But I'm proud to say I'm a Welsh writer. Thank you.
I was just thinking, since you like short story writing more than novels, and you have this amazing imagination to write a story about seahorses, if you've ever thought about children's literature. A typical book for a preschooler is 32 pages with lots of great illustrations, and I think you could write about emus, because the mums are deadbeats and they leave the eggs with the dads. Just putting that out there.
We'll go halves, right? We'll go halves on royalty to make us out. God, I always thought I wanted to write children, but it feels even harder. Even
I
harder.
think it can, yeah.
Yeah. And it's not that I'm interested in in novels. I'm thinking about what a novel might look like from me. I have some bad ones. I have some further bad ones on the hard drive. But I think one of the things I've had to kind of, and I'll wrap this up now. This might be the last one, but it's like this question of like short stories versus the novel. They're often put into opposition in some way, and an honest answer for a lot of writers is why write a novel versus a story is the kind of the financial imperative. So like my advance, what I got paid for these two books, I signed a 2-book deal in 2014 for £15,000. The first book was a book of stories, £5,000, and they were going to pay me £10,000 for an unwritten novel. So before I'd even written it, it was worth twice as much. Yeah. And then I have friends who might have got paid £100,000 or £250,000 for a novel. And so the publishing industry incentivizes authors to write novels as opposed to stories. And I got really lost and stuck in this while I was writing. The second book was meant to be a novel because I felt I confused and conflated the external value put on the work with its intrinsic value to me. And I was trying to turn everything into a novel. And I compare it with like when you have an image on a computer and you resize it, and he loses resolution. And I had to go, fuck no. Doesn't, like, it's not about that. And in my head, I thought, if I write a novel, I'll be out of poverty. Sorry, which is like a ridiculous thing to say, because you can write, plenty of great novelists never made any money from it. And so one of the things I had to come to peace with is, if I'm going to write short stories, is that I may never make a living from it, but it's a way for me to feel alive. So that's why I've sat with that.
Sorry, I was going to chip in there. Just you could do the turbulence thing where you just
Stick them together.
stick together.
Yeah.
I'm going to go on to Mary.
Thanks very
Thanks,
much, Thomas. And yes, we'd like some audience participation, please, for the next two poems. And the first one is called Measure, and it's about my mother, and it comes from the Irish language as well. And she wasn't very pleased to be written about, actually, and she may more like say, tell her nothing, you know, or you'll end up in a poem, and you mightn't want to be in it. But she was very elderly when this came about, and she was remembering some words from the Irish language for different measures. And there are measures mentioned in this: bushels, naggins, gills. Does anybody remember those measures? They're from the long ago, but even earlier than that were armfuls and handfuls. So you're going to do this with me: bushels, naggins, gills. Bushels, naggins, gills. Bushels, naggins, gills. Bushels, naggins, gills. Go.
Keep going. All right,
Bushels,
you guys got to keep going.
naggins,
keep saying that.
gills.
The whole poem.
Bushels, naggins, gills.
A mound of hay with my arms could encircle, a gowl of oats what would
Bushels,
fit in my hands. A
naggins,
mound of hay that my
gills.
arms could encircle,
Bushels,
a gowl of oats what would fit in
naggins,
my hands.
gills.
Mound of hay that my arms could encircle, a gowl of oats that would fit in my hands. A mound of hay that my arms could encircle, gowl of oats that would fit in my hands.
Bushels, naggins, gills. Bushels, naggins, gills. Bushels, naggins, gills. A maum of hay, what your arms could encircle. A gowl of oats, what would fit in your two scooped hands. Measures I'd never heard of, till she remembered them from far away. Long lost measures, bushels, naggins, gills. Forced into sterile metric. The measure of her eludes me always. And now her dwindling mind and waning strength slips from my mom, pours through my gowl.
Well done, everyone.
Is I Want Your Help Again. It's called The Wren and the Riddle, The Wren and the Riddle, The Wren and the Riddle, and it's going to be played with a jig.
The wren and the riddle. 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 riddle. The wren and the 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 riddle.
So now we have Betty Gottelsmeter, who is going to present the open mic. Thank you.
Never mind, weird name, I know. Gotthelmseder. Yeah, hi, I'm Betty. I am a final year student writing and literature at ATU, and I have the honor to present to you tonight our one open mic reader, my colleague, the wonderful Ava Liange.
Hi, I wrote this poem. It's a work in progress. It's called A Home. Before I turn into ashes, I want to build a house. I want to paint the walls lavender and tangerine colors. I want lace curtains at the windows to filter the pearly rays of the moon. I want to dig my hands into the earth and place fresh cut flowers in every room. I want dried herbs hanging down the kitchen walls. I want necklaces and seashells knit into the edges of my canopy bed. I want a wooden staircase with a small window, always open, to let the ivy crawl inside. And at last I will see the flesh that brings me warmth, the body I lay my soul in. Thank you.
Okay, so it was a short and sweet open mic, but thank you very much for taking part. So actually we had a lovely evening tonight anyway, so we had a great conversation, great audience Q&A, so I think it all came together just perfectly timed. I just want to say a massive thank you to Thomas and Elske for a fascinating conversation. And I think we all have, or we're all learning a better understanding of seahorses, or intending to find out a bit more. Thank you for that. I just want to say thank you again to the open mic and the audience as well for taking part in our Q&A. And a big thank you to Mary Branley and the GreenbirdFlying band, who have just been amazing tonight, really mesmerising. And just before I hand you back to Mary for a final song, I just wanted to tell you a few upcoming events in Sligo Library. So we have a full schedule for the Word between now and May. We have Elaine Feeney in February, Mancon Magan in March. We have Tim Hannigan in April and Johnny Grogan in May. So there's a full schedule all ready to go, and it's all up on our website if you want more details. We also have a very special online book club event in February with the author Paul Murray. That's for book clubs only, so if you're interested in that, you can let us know. And we're also hosting our first Circle Cora in March as part of Seachtain na Gaeilge. So it's going to be a public lunchtime event. So if you want to find out more details on that, you can give us a shout. And we have a little leaflet at the desk if you want to get details on events for February and March. So there's lots coming up in the next few weeks. So thanks everybody for joining us this evening, and I'm just going to officially hand you back to Mary for our final song and the Greenbird Flying Band.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, everyone.
This is Cleena Quinlan on violin, a very talented person altogether. Mark Murphy on keyboard. So we've two short poems for you here. The first one is called Final Quarter, and it is about Leland Bardwell's little house perched on the Atlantic with the spume of the storms flying up to the front door. And this was after her departure, really. The house was forlorn, as was I. The house, a nocturne in B-flat minor, whispering flies in F. A rattle of mice barely audible within the cymbalous crash of an incoming sea. Sharp rain on the single panes of glass. A short blast, northwest, to the front half-open door, her heart. A nocturne in B-flat minor, whispering flies in F, a rattle of mice barely audible within the cymbalous crash of an incoming C-sharp, a rain on the single panes of glass, a sharp blast, northwest, through the half-open door, her heart. Just before dawn, put me back in the same room I went to sleep in, or someplace else I recognize. After all that traveling in the dark, spinning with thirsty dreams, let me not have forgotten to buy milk and tea, Please leave something of the journey, a thread, a fragment of the other world. Put me back gently so the cracks don't jar as the birds awaken.